Hello, and welcome to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science, where we're going to take a look at the spotted lanternfly as an example of an invasive species and ask the question, is this a harbinger of doom or prophecy of the future in a global economy? So, like all of these ethical dilemmas in science, it's based on current events, and so a couple articles that come out in August of 2022. The first one, an article in Time, taking a look at why scientists want you to kill spotted lanternflies, and then another article in CNN talking about the spotted lanternflies that are thriving in the Northeast and how scientists are worried that they're going to spread even further across the United States. So what is it? We take a look at it. It's, fairly, attractive looking little bug. It's a spotted lanternfly, but it's not a moth. It's not even actually a fly. It's more closely related to cicadas and aphids, and it is an example of an organism known as a plant hopper. Now, the spotted lanternflies are native to Southeast Asia and were first seen in Berks County, Pennsylvania in 2014, so roughly 8 years ago now at this point. It's believed that these first spotted lanternflies came into the United States imported from South Korea on some landscape stone. So basically the seed cases were located on the stone and basically brought these organisms over. Now, this is an example of an invasive species. It's a non-native species, meaning that it is not normally found within this region of the world, not normally found within the United States. And because of that, it doesn't have its normal predators. And because it doesn't have these normal predators, it has the potential to rapidly explode in terms of their population. They can overpopulate and potentially devastate the ecology within a region. Even in Asia, when we take a look at it within South Korea, it's an invasive species where we think it came from. But naturally, in its environment and the ecosystem in Asia, there are going to be normal predators that would feed upon it and keep its growth in check, so keep it somewhat regulated within the region. Now, an article that came out in Nature recently has taken a look at the spread of the spotted lanternflies and trying to figure out, where is it likely that they're going to end up now that they've reached the United States. And so along the right-hand portion of the slide, we can see basically in 2020, we've got a little bit of this kind of red color here, kind of illustrating that the spotted lanternflies are pretty much in that kind of eastern Pennsylvania, maybe a little bit into New Jersey, a little bit into Delaware. But very quickly, by 2022, when this article was published, it spread out upwards to about 11 or 12 states. I find different reports on that, but rapidly spreading throughout the eastern seaboard. Now, what they've done within this study is basically said that there's a chance that it could reach California within the next 5 years, but there's a very high probability that by 2033, so roughly about 10 years from now, without massive efforts to restrain the spread of this, it could reach the fruit-producing regions of California by 2033. And then ultimately put at risk that multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry, the food industry along the West Coast. If we take a look at this, the spotted lanternfly has a preferred host. It prefers the tree of heaven, which is actually another invasive species from Asia. But what we've been able to learn is that even though the tree of heaven is the preferred species, there are a lot of species, a lot of agricultural crops in which the spotted lanternfly is more than happy to feed upon. Like the aphids, they will basically kind of puncture into the plant and draw off the sap, draw off the sugar-rich fluid that is going to be flowing through these plants. We can see that it goes through and has been feeding upon, at least on this slide, we're looking at grapes, apples, cherries, almonds, walnuts, and hops. And again, that predicted pattern showing that it's already established within the grapes and the producing areas for apples. But over the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to see that that is going to expand very, very dramatically within the United States. Again, this invasive species and potential having a huge economic impact on the production of these crops. So if we take a look at it, the spotted lanternfly infestation can result in crop loss, so damage to the plants, damage to the crops that are being produced, the fruits. They are secreting some factors, which we'll take a look at in a second, which causes a mold to develop, which can potentially kill the plants itself, causing disease. It also makes the mold-damaged fruit unmarketable. You can't sell these kind of unusual-looking fruits. Lots of increased management costs in an effort to try to minimize the impact of these spotted lanternflies on the agricultural kind of producing regions, as well as exporting issues. And so if we're looking at these having come into the United States on kind of a shipment of landscaping rocks, there's a concern that if we move fruits or other materials out of the current quarantine zones, these egg masses would aid in the spread of these spotted lanternflies. Another paper, this one's from 2020, taking a look at the impact of the spotted lanternflies on a vineyard. And so on the left-hand side, we can see kind of a large infestation region where they basically have gone through, stripped off all of the leaves, damaged these grape plants, and pretty much devastated this vineyard. On the right-hand side, we've got a little bit kind of a slower kind of spread of the spotted lanternflies. You can see that it's culled back the leaves of these plants. Hasn't killed it completely, but with additional time, it could be very devastating to these plants. Now, if we take a look at these spotted lanternflies, like I said, they're similar to aphids, so they're going to puncture into these plants, draw off the sugar-rich fluids, and then feed upon that. Now, this is going to damage the plants, attract other secondary invaders, other insects that will go and then feed on these damaged, weakened plants. They're going to release, these spotted lanternflies are going to release a honeydew, this product that is going to be released from them. That it's a deposit that can end up basically on any surface. If you're outside, it's going to end up on you or on surfaces, lawn furniture, all of that type of thing. But the risk is that this honeydew that they're producing, this waste product that they're producing, this excess sugar, supports the growth of a sooty mold. And that sooty mold will build up on these plants, blocking photosynthesis, and it can actually go through and weaken or kill the plants. So what we can take a look at is that there's a major effort to try to reduce the spread of these spotted lanternflies. A lot of efforts both within the USDA, the federal government, as well as local governments, are encouraging kind of going through, kind of eliminating these spotted lanternflies, so stomping on them if you come across them, scraping up and destroying the egg masses as you find them. And so this government effort to eradicate the spotted lanternflies gave rise to a memory of the movie Starship Troopers from 1997. So just a short clip from that.
Everyone's doing their part. Are you? The war effort needs your effort. At work, at home, in your community.
And so we can see that there's an effort to eradicate the spotted lanternfly as an invasive species that could potentially damage the agriculture, the plants that are normally found within the United States region. And by damaging the plants, they would have a kind of ripple effect throughout the ecosystem by affecting the other animals and insects that would normally feed upon those plants. And so there's an effort to kind of eliminate these spotted lanternflies. Kind of at the simplest level, down here at the bottom, we're looking at cultural change, cultural control, where you'd basically go through and eliminate kind of preferred hosts. But in reality, This is likely to have very minimal effects on the spread of the spotted lanternflies, mainly because they're able to adapt to and feed upon a whole variety of other types of plant species. Next, looking at this kind of physical and mechanical control, this is where we're going through seeing efforts to kind of smash the bugs if we find them, to scrape off the egg masses and destroy them if we see them. And we can also see many regions where people have started putting in circle traps, just a band of sticky substance around the trunk of trees, because these spotted lanternflies, as leaf hoppers, are relatively weak flyers. And so they're going to crawl up the bark of a plant, crawl up the outside of the trunk to get to the higher regions to be able to kind of glide down and spread. The problem with these sticky materials in these circle traps is that they're not selective. They're going to trap other insects, and if you don't cover them and put them out properly, you can end up, trapping squirrels and other animals. Going higher up within this area, within the biological control, right now we haven't identified any natural biological enemies for the spotted lanternflies within the United States. And so there's continued research going on with that, which leads into kind of looking at a variety of chemical controls. And so with these chemical controls, you're basically looking at treating areas of infestation of these spotted lanternflies with insecticides. And again, as chemical essentially poisons for these insects, they have varied degrees of selectivity, and so there's a risk of killing kind of beneficial insects or very important pollinators that are necessary for, kind of our fruit setting and important for the agricultural industry. And there are also risks that these insecticides, these chemicals, can get into the groundwater and contaminate the water. Now, if you go on to the internet, go onto the web, and try to look for solutions, there are a lot of claims of homemade sprays of varying effectiveness, and you need to be careful with those because, again, they could be potentially harmful to humans, pets, and other plants. And so there needs to be a fair amount of research done before you start to use these chemicals in an effort to kind of minimize the spread of these spotted lanternflies. Now, the spotted lanternflies aren't the only invasive species that we see within the United States. Not only within the United States, but invasive species kind of around the world. Now, one example of this, kind of traditionally known as the gypsy moth, it's now been renamed by the Entomological Society of America as the spongy moth, kind of in recognition of the kind of spongy masses that you would see kind of growing in trees. And this is from the Philadelphia Inquirer. These, again, are another invasive insect that can go through, defoliate the trees, basically strip off the leaves as they're feeding, making them vulnerable to disease and death. Now, these spongy moths, previously known as gypsy moths, have been in the United States since about 1870. And there have been major efforts to minimize the spread, but there's still a major impact on plants throughout the United States. Going beyond the United States, looking at another invasive species, a paper that came out in August 2022, taking a look at the European rabbits within Australia. What they've been able to do through genetic testing has been able to see that the majority of the rabbits that are in these kind of massive plagues that kind of go through and devastate the natural ecosystem, devastate the plants, and then the removal of plants eliminates the food sources for the animals, and so threatening native plants and animals. They came from a single import of rabbits that were brought in from England in 1859, still having massive effects on the ecosystem, the ecology within Australia, estimated to affect the agricultural sector at a range of about $200 million per year. Now, not all people feel that there is a need to kind of eliminate the spotted lanternflies. This couple articles that came out again in the summer of 2022, basically saying, well, maybe it isn't enough to kind of smash these bugs. What is one person going to be able to do? It's a beautiful insect, as insects go. What other things could be done? And so some of them are taking the bug side. Still, there's a huge ecological impact associated with invasive species, a huge potential economic impact on agriculture within the United States as these spotted lanternflies spread. And so this gives rise to our ethical dilemma in science for this week. How do we mitigate the threat of invasive species on the local ecology? As we talked about, there have been efforts to kind of minimize kind of movement of these organisms between quarantined regions and regions that don't have them right now. So how do you balance the ecological protection from having a quarantine or having a search as things are shipped from one region to another? Looking at imports from Southeast Asia, there's an effort to kind of screen for these Asian gypsy moths to eliminate those coming into the United States. But that adds to the cost, that adds to a shipping delay associated with that. When should an invasive species be targeted for eradication? I think, many people, if a mosquito lands on you, you're going to swat at the mosquito and kind of smush it. But, you're going to be, feeling fairly lucky if a ladybug lands on you. Should we eradicate species if they're a nuisance? Should we eradicate them if they are then having an impact on human beings? Do we eradicate them if they're a threat towards the commercial agriculture? And then finally, does the decision to eradicate an invasive species depend on the type of organism? It's one thing to swat at a bug or go through and cut out an invasive plant. But what happens if it's a nice cuddly little bunny, if we're taking a look at the rabbits of Australia, or another type of charismatic animal? Where is the decision made? Who makes the decision as to which of these invasive species should be targeted for removal? So thank you for listening to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science, where we're taking a look at invasive species. You can see additional information and references in the description below. Thank you, and have a great week.